It's my pleasure to welcome Anne Blum to the Do Tell Virtually podcast. Anne Blum has a deep background in organizational development and learning, working with both large and small firms. She currently is the senior instructional designer at Roundtable Learning in Cleveland. She specializes in creating learning solutions that drive application and sustained behavior change. Please help me welcome Anne Blum to the Do Tell Virtually podcast.
Hi, my name is Anne Blum. I'm an instructional designer with an organization called Roundtable Learning. We specialize in corporate training solutions using multiple modalities, including augmented and virtual reality.
So Anne, tell me, how long have you been doing instructional design?
I've been actively doing instructional design for about 20 years, which means that I've been doing it long enough that what used to be considered high tech was sending a CD-ROM out with your workbooks.
You mean you don't do that anymore? No more CD-ROMs? Really?
Well, we've moved on from that. And COVID-19 and all of the working from home has really given all of us an opportunity to bring to light a lot of the excellent alternative modalities that are available to people.
So for those who aren't in instructional design, tell me what you mean by modality. Give me an example.
A modality is how information is delivered. So for the most common modality is classroom training, where a learner or a group of learners sit with an instructor and are able to interact with each other face-to-face. Other common modalities are e-learning, which sometimes is called computer-based training, where you might sit in front of a screen and be fed information that way.
So that might be like an on-demand class where there's certain things you have to do to get to the next levels, and maybe at the end you get a certificate.
Exactly.
But you can do it in your pajamas, in your kitchen, at 3 a.m. if you want, right? There's no teacher, there's no live teacher in those situations.
There's no live teacher. Those types of classes are what's known as asynchronous, which is a fancy word for saying that you can do it on your own time.
So in this time, which is why we are talking now about this big transition we're making from live to virtual, you've actually been doing virtual training and instructional design for a long time. So I thought we'd ask you a few questions about what do we need to know in that transition from those of us who have been spending our entire lives training in a live setting to now training and teaching in a virtual setting. So let's just start with a really simple table stake question. How do people process knowledge virtually?
That's a very interesting question. And one of the most important things to understand is that the way that our brains actually take in and work through information is the same regardless of how that information is delivered to us. So when we think about information processing, it's really a misnomer because there's several different things happening all at once. So the first part of information processing is what's known as behaviorism. And behaviorism is what you're actually doing when you're learning. How does the brain respond to stimuli? And when it comes to processing virtually, the big difference between processing information that you're receiving virtually and processing information that you're receiving face-to-face is the range of stimuli that can distract you. So that when you're in a classroom setting, whoever is teaching or leading or facilitating really can control the environment. But when that's happening virtually, there's much less control. And so what you need to do as an instructor is really think about how can you narrow that focus. The second thing to think about is cognition. And cognition is how the brain understands. And in this respect, really the brain functions the same regardless of the modality. But what's different when you're thinking about being a presenter or an instructor virtually is that you have less ability to gauge the cognition of your participants. When you're teaching in front of a classroom, you can use nonverbal cues to really gauge how well they're understanding the information. But in a virtual setting, you've got to be much more intentional about making sure that people are following along, making sure that you're either speeding up or slowing down to give your participants the opportunity to continue to build on prior knowledge and prior learning. And then the final piece of processing information is recognition. And I think of recognition as sort of the aha moment. And that's the moment when the participant or the learner sees themselves in the story. It's the moment where they think, not only do I understand this piece of information, but I now also really understand how I can apply it and how I will apply it. And we'll get to this in a minute, but when we talk about delivering information virtually, you need to be a lot more intentional to drive to that point of recognition.
So, knowing these three pieces about how we process information, what do we need to know now about how to incorporate that into what you say and how you say it virtually?
The first thing is just being aware of it can help you be more intentional about it and thinking about the three separate processes and being intentional about activities that drive towards cognition versus activities that drive towards recognition. So one of the things that I like to do is when you're talking specifically about the behavior part, is understanding that because you can't control the stimuli, what you can control is the length and the focus. So truly, when you're talking about training virtually, less is more. Think about very focused, very targeted messages, short microbursts of learning, because since you don't know what else is going on in the life of your learner, you can think about maybe you can fully capture their attention for 10 minutes and then come back to them in a week for another 10 minutes. You'll get a lot better participation and recognition and cognition than if you try and go for a longer session.
So now knowing what we know about how we process information and also how to start to think about raising awareness and bringing that over to virtual audiences, talk to us for a minute about our attention spans and how long things can last in virtual settings when you're trying to teach something. So you might have like an hour and a half class. Is that a good thing? And just try to use some of these tools that you're using to change up the information, make it more snackable, bring them more activity. Talk to us about timing.
An hour and a half is the absolute upper limit of what I would consider. Rule of thumb is to really try to keep it at no more than 45 minutes. If it's something where it has to be an hour and a half, think if you can break it into two parts to give people, if nothing else, just literally the opportunity to physically move at 45 minutes. The thing that determines how long it should be is partially how important the topic is to the learner. One of the things that I like to do is to sort of set up a quid pro quo with the learner, which is to say, if you can give me your full attention for 45 minutes, I can guarantee that you will be able to do X. And the more important X is to the learner, the more attention they'll pay for those 45 minutes. But what that means is you have to be very focused on your content.
Very focused on your content in terms of being concise, shutting out all the stuff that doesn't matter at that moment, not trying to overtalk or over-explain things.
Not trying to overtalk and not trying to over-explain things, but also really trying to be on target with understanding what your audience needs to know and not trying to throw in everything in the kitchen sink. So if what you're trying to teach is a 4-step process, teach them the 4 steps to the process. They don't need to know the history of how you got to 4 steps.
How much you love
with,
it,
with
all the people that wrote about it.
Exactly. Even though I'm sure that it's fascinating to you. And if those are the perfect kinds of pieces of other information, other good information that you can then use to follow up with your learners later on. But what you want to make sure is that you use those periods of engagement when you're actually with them virtually to deliver whatever the most critical pieces of information are.
And we know from being content and storytelling coaches, that's most of what we try to train people to do, is to get rid of the stuff that just doesn't matter.
Correct. Depending on the content that you're trying to deliver, as I had said earlier, the goal really is to move from cognition to recognition, right? So that you want to build that understanding, and then you want to help people to see themselves in the story and help them think about how they will apply the information that you're sharing. And so one of the things to think about is how you structure your information. And one of the most effective things to do is to think about laddering the information so that you are essentially building on prior learning and calling back to it. So a couple of minutes ago, we used the example of teaching a 4-step process. And what you'd want to think about is you teach the first step, and then as you were teaching the second step, instead of introducing it as a whole new step, you'd want to build on the prior learning by saying, this is how step 2 is the same as step 1, and this is how step 2 is different than step 1. And then when you get to step 3, you've already established that rhythm that allows you then to build on step 1 and build on step 2 as you introduce step 3. And by laddering the information like that, you allow participants to continually grasp new information while reflecting on the information you've already shared.
And you're also talking about something that we pay attention to, which is how do we keep their attention, which is, number one priority. When you say those things, they're constantly having to connect the knowledge and the information and less likely to want to go read an email, send a text, because you're laddering something where the aggregate is important, not just the individual point.
Absolutely. The other thing to keep their attention is learners are selfish, and learners generally are listening to you or taking your class, not because they think you're a great person, but because they want to gain the knowledge to do something. And so the more you can use examples of how they can apply it, examples of what applying it will mean for them, what applying it will allow them to do, is how you really keep their attention. It's that old what's in it for me.
That's right. I was just going to say it's the with them for sure.
Exactly.
So as we close out this conversation, which has been extremely helpful for me personally and hopefully our listeners, for understanding the transition again between going from live to virtual, and what I want to ask now is, when you see bad learning design, what are the top 2 or 3 things that people are ignoring in what you just talked about, where for sure it's going to fail by looking at it at the first minute or 2?
The 3 things that I see the most often are it's too long, it's not focused, and there's too many people with different objectives involved. So the narrower your audience, the more tailored you can make your presentation and build that what's in it for me.
Right. So if you're trying to do a webinar for 300 people that all have different agendas and objectives, it's probably going to be a difficult one to reach those goals because you're trying to serve many masters as opposed to one.
As one of my old coaches used to say to me, don't try to boil the ocean.
That's right. Boil the pot of water. Well, Anne, thank you so much for being on the Do Tell podcast. We appreciate your time, your expertise, and your willingness to share both. So thanks again.
It's my pleasure, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Hey, thank you so much for listening to the Do Tell Virtually podcast. We have a lot of others in our series if you're interested in how to become your best virtual self, whether you're a speaker, trainer, teacher, facilitator, or salesperson. You can also check out our website at www.articulationinc.com. That's the word articulationinc.com. Thanks so much for tuning in, and have a great day.